Throughout history, gender has played an important and complicated role. Different countries and institutions have held different beliefs on gender and therefore have had different historical impacts. Consequently, it's interesting to look at European influence on Native American gender roles.
Our primary source is a conversation between Native Americans in the 1600s. It shows how Native Americans' perspectives toward their wives and women in their tribes differs from how the English settlers might view their wives and women in their society.
This source was written by Roger Williams in 1643. He studied the indigenous languages across New England and was the first person to publish a book about indigenous languages in English.
In this source, a group of Nagasaki men are having a conversation about their customs. They discuss the role of women in agriculture, saying that they oversee and maintain corn and fruit. They admire the women's speed in harvesting and hoeing the fields. Everyone in the tribe, men and women, help each other harvest corn, build forts, hunt, and fish.
This source shows how women were given more authority in Native societies than women in Western societies. In addition, the men clearly respect the talents of the women, emphasizing the hard work that they do. These customs are much different than Western societies, where women didn't oversee anything and were not acknowledged for their talents.
According to Kathleen A. Ward in Before and After the White Man, Indian Women, Property, Progress, and Power, European influence has held a profound effect on the rights of women in Native American culture.
Ward mentions that in Native American societies, gender was a key factor in determining the role of a person within a family and within a tribe. Despite this, anyone, regardless of their gender, was able to pursue whatever they wanted and was able to obtain power within their society.
Gail D. Danvers in Gender and Encounters, Warriors, Women, and William Johnson highlights the equal importance of both men and women in the Iroquois society. These examples also highlight how in the Iroquois, the role of men and women were quite different, but both equally important. Though it is important to remember that the term Iroquois is a blanket group of several Native American tribes. When using this term, it's important to recognize that Native American tribes have many different traditions and customs for each other. However, there is little written about individual tribes, and tribes in the Iroquois group seem to have shared some similar beliefs.
According to Ward, Native American women held higher positions in their duties than many European women did. They were not only head of households, but oversaw agricultural production. Property was owned by women, as well as any other assets obtained within a marriage. They could become the equivalent of doctors, politicians, chefs, and could decide on whatever profession they wanted.
Ward says that women were also responsible for negotiating any property and land disputes. Women controlled the land on the outskirts of these tribal properties. They also had authority to select and remove the chief.
Gail Danvers explains that this dynamic confused many of the Europeans, as many of the traders had been instructed to communicate with the leading men of the tribes. She discusses this in her article, which follows the life of William Johnson, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs. Johnson is a good example of the European influence on the Iroquois people, and he was highly involved with the Iroquois society and learned how to navigate their social customs.
When Mr. Johnson married an Iroquois woman, this union would increase his political and social power. Through his wife, Molly, he could make important connections and expand his influence.
Still, many Europeans felt that Native American women held an unnatural amount of political power and felt this should change. Johnson was uncomfortable with women being involved in politics and made a point to only speak to male chiefs. Johnson and European men like him started appealing directly to the Iroquois men, bypassing the traditional sources of authority. Consequently, he diminished the Iroquois women's necessity in society and therefore their social power.
Johnson was also involved in the appointment of chiefs, a role traditionally bestowed upon women. Johnson's actions serve as an example in the views and beliefs of many European men during this time period. These beliefs impacted the Iroquois people and the structure of their society. In a brief time, the gender roles and influences of the Iroquois people were greatly changed.
Ward describes how the power of women in Native society was completely changed by European influence. Women were turned into inferior and sexual beings by the white men and were robbed of their rights within society.
She discusses that women were depicted as naked and sexual objects by European men. Native cultures were deemed as inferior to European cultures because they did not have the same sexism and patriarchy.
She mentions that many white men believed that women should not work in agriculture, which many Native American women did. When white men colonized Native American women, many of the traditions were abolished.
She states that men were turned into the head of household and that the women's land was given to the men. Native women's sexual freedom was taken away by Christian missionaries, and they were put into the role that European women had been forced to fit for centuries.
According to Mel Arvin and her associates in Decolonizing Feminism, Challenging Connections Between Settler Colonialism and Heteropatriarchy, we do not often hear enough about the violence that has historically been imposed on Native women. Although we learn about U.S. history, it is rare that we hear about the negatives settlers imposed on women and children. They try to erase Native American history and culture by putting Native American children into boarding schools, forcing them to learn English, and subjecting them to Western stereotypes in which they were not accustomed to.
They discuss how colonists tried to impose Western government upon the Native Americans, as well as rid them of their cultural identities. Often, the Western stereotypes they forced onto women were almost always sexual and discriminatory. This too was imposed on their children, forcing them into gender roles not prominent in Native culture beforehand.
In conclusion, in human history, distinct roles and jobs have been assigned to people based on their gender, but Europeans and Native Americans have historically clashed based on their perceptions of correct gender roles. And it is important to look at gender roles in early American society before European domination to understand this.